I was recently lucky enough to purchase an insanely good condition single valve G Bugle. Now that I own a G Bugle, I think it's time that we did a video on them, especially when you consider that in the vast history of drum corps, the B-flat horn is still a fairly new addition to the ensemble of sound that we use in drum corps. So today, let's talk about G Bugles. As you can see here, I have a variety of instruments. We have on that end a cornet, then we have the single valve G Bugle that I purchased. We have the 3-valve G Bugle. We have a 2-valve FE Olds G Bugle, the euphonium one, and then normal B-flat trumpet. So we'll be using these. I would like to give a shout out to the Freelancers Drum and Bugle Corps. One of their alumni offered to let me borrow these two horns right here. So super appreciative of them. And then let's just get right into the video. First off, the majority of the information I'll be discussing in this video was information that I found through Scooter Pirtle's article on the evolution of the G Bugle at Middle Horn Leader, as well as it was used in the drum corps history book produced by Drum Corps World. I'll leave a link to that webpage in the description for the full article. Starting off, the natural trumpet / bugle, whatever you want to call it, they're pretty much the same thing, is a length of tubing that flares out into a bell. Usually you will have a single length of tubing with a mouthpiece. It'll go in and around, and then it'll flare out into a bell. These instruments were very commonly used by the United States military to signal orders to the troops. The bugles would be carried by officers, designated buglers, and cavalrymen most prominently. However, through the 19th century, units consisting of buglers, drummers, and fife players would start popping up across the army and its other branches. Eventually, the use of the fife would die out, and drum and bugle corps, which was what remained, those kinds of units would become the standard used across the military. In the early 1890s, the United States Army was testing out different versions of the bugle to replace the currently used Regulation F bugle that was used across the military. There were various keys of bugles that were tested out throughout this process, but in 1892, the G pattern bugle would become regulation across the Army, and it became so popular that it was standardized across all of the other branches of military. This standardization of the G bugle would be responsible for the use of that specific horn in competitive drum corps for the next 100 years. In the 1920s, bugles with a vertical valve were beginning to be produced. That would likely have been around the time that this specific horn was manufactured. This horn is a Slingerland Drum Company horn. It's called the Howard C. Noble model. I'll see if the camera can get that. Let's see. Will it focus? There you go. So these kinds of horns began kind of popping up, but very quickly you would find that the single valved horns were not really produced with a vertical valve. A lot of these single valved horns, actually most of them, about probably 99% of them, in America at least, were produced with a single valve that was placed horizontally along the bell. So there's a few reasons for that. Originally, valves were not allowed by the VFW and the American Legion, which were the organizations that kind of set the rules for competitive drum corps in America. And so because of that, there are theories that originally the horizontal valve became a way to hide the valve from the VFW and American Legion. However, obviously when the valve later became allowed, people thought that, or at least what I read in Scooter Pirtle's article, is that the horizontal valve remained because of the nice aesthetic look that it gave the horn. Obviously, if this kind of valve, it sticks out very much. Even when you see it on that side, it's a very big portion of the horn that sticks out vertically. And so having a horizontal valve gave it a somewhat nicer look. So the purpose originally of allowing the vertical valve was solely to let drum corps change the key of an instrument. And so what I mean by that is if you look on this horn, I'm going to hold it close to the camera, you see this little screw here on this side. So with this screw, the purpose of that is that you could leave it open and you would screw it in. And by leaving it open, you could not push this valve down. I'm putting pressure on that. It will not go down. So this will force the instrument to stay in the key of G. Alternatively, you could push the valve down and then screw it back in. And then it would stay in the key of D. And so that's how you would play it. As you can see, I'm not pressing the button and staying right there. That screw kind of locks it in place. And so that would allow you to put the horn in the key of D. The reason for that specific ruling is because the VFW and American Legion kind of wanted a certain level of playing field that all of the drum corps could compete on. There was drum corps that did not have the money to purchase a valved bugle. Obviously, they could still compete with the other drum corps as long as they maybe had some bugles that were naturally in the key of D rather than the key of G. Obviously, the allowance of the free use of this piston right here would be allowed later on. But even with the single valve, a lot of members in drum corps would find that there was a very limited number of notes. With that certain restriction of the amount of notes that you could play, even with the free use of this valve, there was a weird technique that kind of started growing called slide slipping. I think that's what it was called. So this is a very, very long piece of tubing. And so because it's very long, you could actually place this piece of tubing right here. There's a marking there. Actually, let's see. There's a marking right there. And so what that marking is meant to do is basically would allow you to pitch the bugle into the key of F instead of the key of G. Either way, because you had such a very large amount of tubing, a lot of members, what they started doing was sanding down and really lubricating these tubes. And as they were playing, they would play and pull it out. And by pulling it out a certain amount, they would be able to get some half steps out of that. So with that becoming super popular, the VFW and American Legion allowed a single rotary valve along the bottom of the instrument, is what you would find at most places. That rotary valve would allow you to basically do that slide slipping technique without actually having to move the tuning slide. And so it gave you the option to play half steps between a lot of the notes. Now, the single rotary valve gave you some half steps. Obviously, it didn't give you a full chromatic scale, so you still had a lot of restrictions, and the rotary valve was usable, but it wasn't really perfect. Now, when we jump ahead to the year 1967, due to pressure by the leading instrument manufacturers and influential figures in the activity, the American Legion would legalize the use of an F piston as opposed to the current D one. So what I have right here, this is a G bugle with a D piston. So a lot of these instrument manufacturers wanted the F piston as well as the drum corps. And so what they would do is they would change this valve to F. And because it was just a single valve, a lot of these instrument manufacturers allowed the drum corps to just send in the amount of horns that they had to those manufacturers so that they could be altered with an F piston rather than a D one. With the addition of the F piston, you could get out, and the use of the rotary valve, you could get out a fully chromatic scale between the notes of F to G with the exception of A flat. When we jump ahead to 1971, a number of drum corps, a lot of us know this already, a number of drum corps formed Drum Corps International as a way to govern themselves rather than being governed by the VFW, American Legion, and then kind of the CYO, but mostly the VFW and American Legion. There were a number of reasons for the formation of DCI. Those can go into, like, financial reasons was a big part of that, but when you look at DCI in the perspective of ruling the types of instruments that could be used in drum corps, that was probably a very big moment for the change of drum corps instruments. When you kind of think about it, this instrument was probably made around the 20s. And so from the 20s to the 1970s, there was very few innovations that were made in the horn. We talked about the rotary valve and the F piston, but largely these horns remained pretty much the same. So after being formed, DCI made a number of rules regarding to the competition, but you have to think about it a certain way. The VFW and American Legion were organizations that were mainly run by veterans. And so a lot of the veterans, not all of them, but a lot of the veterans weren't actual musicians. So when it comes to making rules about the G bugle, they made those rules and regulations in regards to how the military made the rules and regulations regarding how the instruments were meant to be used and what kinds of instruments could be used. Now, we can't forget that DCA, which was comprised of all-age corps and senior corps, had actually been formed 11 years prior to DCI. But back to DCI, for the first 4 years in its existence, the single-valved bugles, so now with the F key and the rotary piston, were still the only horns allowed in the field. However, in 1975, a proposal was made that allowed horns to add a second valve. So let me move on to that second valve bugle.
What is the difference between the horn that you play and the horns that we're seeing out here?
Well, do you want to take a look at that? Because I have
Sure.
one that I've been looking at, and Steve is going to also give me a trumpet lesson here, or a bugle lesson. Excuse me, there I go again.
I can see giving you a trumpet lesson.
Right. Well, I tell you what, there's Steve, if you'll tell me why we have 2 valves on yours, I'll tell you why we have 3 valves on mine.
I'll tell you, this is a very, very new development the last couple of years in drum corps. In the old days, of course, the straight bugle. Then we went to the 1-valve bugle that was horizontal.
That's right.
Then we added the rotary, which gave us half-tone flexibility. The 1-valve moved the tone a full step. Then we said, well, we got this here. Why don't we put 2 valves here and move them vertically? And there we go, for greater flexibility. That's
Right.
as far as we've gotten. If we're going to get this far, I don't know. But they sure look a lot the same, don't they?
They look a lot the same, and they sound a lot the same. And I think that's beautiful.
This is an ultra tune by the F.E. Olds Company. So they added the second valve, and there was a number of reasons for that. Obviously, you're allowing a lot more notes by adding the second valve. For the most part, you could get fully chromatic scales with the use of some of the slides on the instrument. It wasn't perfect, but it was definitely a very huge step up from the single valve G bugles that they started with. Now, when that proposal was made, some manufacturers and leaders in the activity believed that if they were going to make a ruling change to the types of instruments that could be used in the field, why not just jump to the 3-valve bugles, which I do have one right here, and we'll get to that. But DCI decided that that was definitely not something that they wanted to do or ever wanted to do. In fact, they actually announced that DCI would never ever allow the 3rd valve, which is kind of ironic, seeing as obviously that would happen later on. Now, the kind of idea behind adding the 3rd valve rather than going to the 2nd valve, going straight to the 3rd valve, there was a number of reasons. The 3rd valve would allow for a perfectly chromatic scale without any of like the weird things you would have to do regarding slides or kind of bending, that kind of stuff. But it would also probably be an easier transition for band students as well. At this point, trumpets and cornets were they still are, but mainly trumpets nowadays. But back then, trumpets and cornets were mainly the instruments that band students at high schools were using in their classes. So by allowing the 3rd valve, they kind of thought that it would be an easier transition for those students to make the jump to drum corps and kind of wouldn't scare them off as much. But the 3rd valve was shot down, and DCI said that they would never ever allow the 3rd valve. The idea of adding the 3rd valve would be proposed and shot down numerous times by DCI until 1990, when they finally decided to legalize the 3-valve bugle. This 3-valve bugle was produced by Dynasty. So Dynasty was one of the leading manufacturers of G bugles at this point. However, Canstol, which was located in Southern California, also produced a majority of the bugles used during this era. Now, I think it's important to note that Zig Canstol and his company were very, very well known for the innovations they provided the drum corps community with. Zig worked with F.E. Olds as well as Kahn and made a whole number of innovations that really the drum corps community could not have probably moved on to the instruments that we have nowadays without that kind of stuff. He basically invented the modern mellophone, as well as the double contrabass tuba that not only drum corps in those times used, but also the drum corps nowadays. That tuba is kind of designed off of Zig's tuba that he manufactured. Zig Canstol and then Dynasty produced a number of these instruments. So obviously with this instrument, with the 3 valves, you get a fully chromatic scale. There's one thing that I want to point out to this about this instrument. Let me pull up the single valve bugle right here. So, let's see, can I get these both in camera shot? Here we go. So the single valve bugle and the 3rd valve G bugle, they don't really look to have a lot in common. Even the bell, I mean, you can see that. Just look how much larger that bell is. The bell flare is still somewhat similar in terms of the speed at which the bell flares out, and that adds a lot to the sound. But the bell flare is just much bigger on this horn. This is even though this horn is fairly light, both these horns are kind of tanks. At this point, nowadays we have nickel/silver plated instruments. Back then, a lot of these instruments were actually chrome plated. And so that's why you see instruments like this, which is probably over 100 years old at this point, in pretty good condition in addition to this one as well. And so the chrome plating would add a lot to the durability of the horn as well as the sound. I mean, this is a very heavy horn, even compared to the trumpet, the B-flat trumpet, a very, very heavy horn. So this horn is obviously the only really, I would say, comparison that you could make between this and the first valve horn is that it's in the key of G, and it's got a similar taper in the bell flare. Now, one instrument that this is a lot closer to is the cornet. So this is a B-flat cornet. This is also produced by the F.E. Olds company. And this is the Dynasty G Bugle. Now look at the wrap. Very, very similar there. And then on the first valve and third valve slides, obviously that's kind of what you see on a trumpet. But what you have to remember is that when they produced these horns, they kind of stopped going for the conicity that you would see in a bugle. Before we move to the final point on the timeline, which is the allowing of instruments in any key, we need to talk about what makes a G bugle a bugle. Many people claim that the conical shape of the horn, when we talk about the lead pipe moving through the bell, is what makes a bugle rather than a trumpet. And that definition is true. But that's really not the case with G bugles. Now, if we were talking about a natural trumpet or bugle, yes, that would be the case, where there's no valves and the rate of conicity, which is basically the bore change from the lead pipe through the bell, that would be true on a natural trumpet. But in G bugles, that's not really the case. Now, that's not to say that there's not a slight difference in conicity between this and what we would see on a B-flat trumpet, but this is basically the equivalent to what you would get on maybe a cornet, and not even that. Now, these Dynasty horns, you can see that they do taper slightly. This is slightly bigger bore than what you get in the mouthpiece / the receiver right here. But on later models, especially like the power bore models from Canstol, those are cylindrical. Those are basically the same. They're even more cylindrical than what you would get on a cornet. So when we take that into account, the semantics kind of dictate that these are trumpets in the key of G. And technically, I mean, that's what it is. This is a trumpet in the key of G. But that's not to say that they didn't have a different sound, and we'll get to that. Now, the sound characteristics were a lot warmer on these G bugles, and there's a number of reasons for that. You look at the kind of shape that you get in terms of the lead pipe, but also you look at the bell flare. We kind of talked about the bell flare difference from this to a trumpet. Let me have a trumpet right here. So this is a B-flat trumpet. As you can see, the bell flare is slightly different. You see that it begins flaring a lot quicker than what you see on this trumpet right here. So the bell flare is a lot quicker, and then it is a little bit more conical in shape in the bell, but that's about it in terms of conicity that you would get. So that, along with the kind of different bores you would get on a lot of these instruments, you get a larger bore than a trumpet. But that, along with a number of other things, is what made this have a specific sound. But there's another number of reasons why G bugle horn lines sound different, and we're going to get to that. Now, the last thing you would see in terms of innovation to the G bugle, especially the 3-valve G bugles, is the tune any note feature that both Dynasty and Canstol added. I believe Canstol kind of implemented it first, but Dynasty would pick it up as well. And so basically what that was is you would have a spring on the tuning slide here, and then instead of having the saddle for the first valve tuning slide, that saddle would be on the actual tuning slide. And so that allowed you to move the tuning slide somewhat easily, rather than moving a lot of these slides a lot more often. Because, I mean, it's a G bugle. When you add a third valve to any instrument, the tuning, when you go further down the valves, gets worse. And it was a pretty big issue on these horns. The tonality of these and the intonation was not great. So that tune any note feature allowed them to be a lot more in tune. Finally, in 1999, DCI legalized the use of brass bell front instruments in any key, and the rest is history. Now, I don't think we need to talk too much about B-flat horns. It's just a trumpet, so a lot of us know what that is and what the characteristics of that horn are. So I think it's time to get to the playing test on all of these horns. So starting off with the G bugle, the range of notes is somewhat limited, especially when you consider the era that this horn was made in, around the 1920s. Now, it's very important to consider that the modern day trumpet as we know it today probably finished most of the innovations that you would see on the horn in the 60s ish. So at this point in the 1920s, B flat trumpets had been pretty much standardized for about 60 years. So adding a piston wasn't really a new concept, but in terms of using it on a bugle, it was a new concept. Um, so I did mention that you would only be able to use the piston in either G or D, but I'm going to use the valve somewhat freely. But let's do the harmonic series on the horn. Now, when I use the valve freely, I am able to get a single diatonic scale from G to G, and it's very out of tune, and you're going to hear that. It's a very warm instrument. I mean, it's easy to tell why it's so warm. The bell flares very, very quickly, and that adds a lot of warmth to the instrument. Now, this is the horn that I purchased. When I purchased the horn, I was very skeptical of how it would play and how I would feel about it. But after playing on it for a few weeks, I don't agree with the addition, or I don't agree with the people that say that G Bugles were better, but I definitely understand why they think they were better. There are definitely some positives to the instrument, and we're going to see that a lot more when I get to the 3-valve horn. But I mean, a lot of the some of the concepts on the instrument, like lip trilling and like just screaming on the note on the instrument, are so much easier. Like, that is probably the easiest that I've ever done a lip trill or shake, if that's what you want to call it, on a horn, and it was very, very fun playing with this. Let's move on to the 3-valve bugle. So this is the Dynasty bugle. We already talked about that. Obviously, adding the 3rd valve allowed you to play pretty much any arrangement you wanted to, as long as it was pitched in a somewhat friendly key. Obviously, you don't really want to use these keys as more than you have to at all. But yeah, let's play some notes on this thing. I mean, it sounds similar. Um, let's hear the fundamental note. So this is the fundamental note. Obviously, this is way brighter than the single valve G bugle, and obviously that's because this is a lot closer to a cornet/trumpet than an actual bugle. Let's play some notes. I mean, playing on this instrument is just a breeze. It's so easy to just blow through this instrument. And so I won't say that it was particularly louder, but it's definitely easier to project your sound. Now, let's compare. I want to do a blind test now, since we've heard both the single valve and 3-valve G bugle. what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a scale in the key of G on the cornet, on the single valve, the 3-valve, and a trumpet. I'm going to do these in a very random order, so you won't know which instrument that I'm starting with. And then we'll do a comparison to see which one you guys think is better. Maybe we'll do a guessing game. Okay. Instrument number 1. Instrument number 2. Instrument number 3. Instrument number 4. Okay, so the order that I played those instruments in was, first, I played it on a B-flat trumpet. This is actually a Canstel, so this is a Canstel Burbank model designed after Bench back in Burbank. And then the second one that I played on was the single-valved G Bugle. That one's a pretty obvious one. It's very, very different in tone compared to the 3-valve and the cornet. And then this is one that I think probably a lot of people missed on. So number 3 was the 3-valve G Bugle, and then number 4 was the B-flat cornet. Now, obviously they sounded very, very similar, and that's because they're designed very, very similarly. So I think that's something to kind of take in context in terms of, if the cornet and the G Bugle sound so similar, why didn't drum corps go to the cornet? And there's a number of reasons for that. So now that we've played on all of them, we need to discuss something. Why then, with all of the innovations that were put into these horns, did DCI elect to go to the route of any keyed instruments? And really what they mean by that was B-flat instruments. Well, there were a number of reasons for the change. But the skepticism of financial sustainability with these G Bugles was the biggest reason for that change, at least from what I could find. At the time of the decision, there were very few companies still manufacturing G Bugles. We already kind of talked about that. It was Canstel and Dynasty, like this horn. So Canstel and Dynasty were pretty much the only two companies still producing G Bugles. And not only that, but the market for G Bugles was shrinking. So with that kind of stuff, you need to think about the supply was very, very low, and the demand was also growing low. So due to that, the economics of purchasing G Bugles for drum corps were not really sustainable. And not only that, but you need to think about how would drum corps last very long times on these instruments. Nowadays, we see drum corps with B-flat horns, basically trumpets, because they are trumpets. Nowadays, a drum corps will purchase something like this, not really this instrument, but like a Yamaha, or we still see like Yamaha, Jupiter, BAC is now producing kind of drum corps instruments, System Blue for a little while, King, Conselmer. A lot of these companies produce trumpets already. And so with the decision to move towards B-flats, not only would drum corps be gaining a wider market of where they can purchase their B-flat instruments from, but they would also have more options to sell those instruments back. Now, you think about the G Bugle. The G Bugle, two producers pretty much made these horns at this point. And who are you going to sell these old G Bugles to? High schools weren't really interested in purchasing G Bugles, as opposed to B-flat horns, because they played on those B-flat horns. So, not to say they didn't sell these G Bugles after using them, but the only corps they could really sell them to were other smaller drum corps. So, the change split the activity in two. For better or for worse, drum corps were now on B-flats, and there were many that weren't happy with the change, especially citing that there was more power in these G Bugle horns. Obviously, I wasn't there. I'm only 22 years old, so I can't say whether G Bugles actually had more power in them. But I will say this. When you think about the design of the G Bugle in comparison to the evolution of the concert instruments, there's a few things you need to take into account. For one, nowadays, drum corps play on B-flat horns, largely based off of their concert counterparts, especially with the trumpet. That's straight up a concert horn used in a drum corps activity. Mellophone is a completely different instrument on its own, especially considering that the mellophone is in its own key. The mellophone is in the key of F rather than the key of B flat. And then the euphonium is more so designed off of the concert euphonium, I would say. There are a lot of designs that were taken from this into that B flat horn, but for a large portion of that, those are concert horns. And same thing for the tuba. Now, the B-flat tuba is technically still a bugle. It's the only bugle that's still used. But now when you take into account all of those horns have different characteristics in different sound styles, it's a lot harder maybe for a B-flat horn line to project. Not to say they can't, but there's a lot more challenges that go into that and listening to that. Whereas with these horns were largely the same, even from this to what you would get on a baritone compared to what you would get on a tuba. The mellophone was still different, but they're all in the same key. So not only are all of the instruments in the same key, but they all have very similar design characteristics and sound characteristics and tuning characteristics. Now, when you take that all into account, it definitely seems like there's a reason why people say that the G Bugles could have projected more. We will likely never see a G Bugle horn line in the same capacity as pre-2000s DCI again, with the notable exception of the Marine Drum Corps, the Commandant's own. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that, but G Bugles are a very, very important facet to the history of drum corps, and I think it was really important, and I was really appreciative to have these horns with me today and be able to talk about that. Hopefully, I got everything right, and I'm sure that there's some things that I got wrong. But if anyone has any additional information relating to the history and the use of the G Bugle horn, go ahead and send that stuff in the comment section below. I'm sure that I and many others would be interested in reading that. So I'm halfway expecting to see some very, very harsh debate and criticisms on the decision to move away from the G Bugle horn in the comment section down below. And all I ask is that you keep the debate civil. I don't mind seeing people saying, oh, well, G Bugles were better, B flat horns suck, da-da-da-da-da. But let's not have personal attacks or extremely rude comments towards modern day and olden day drum corps. Other than that, I hope you appreciated the video. Again, I was super glad to see these instruments today. I mean, have these and be able to play on them is incredible. So other than that, I will see you guys next time.